Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The Watcher on the Stairs. The house had been in my family for decades, its history stretching back to when my great-grandparents first settled in the area. It was large and imposing, with peeling paint on the exterior and narrow, creaking staircases inside. After my divorce, I needed somewhere affordable to stay, and the house, though aging and isolated, seemed like a practical choice. It was nestled on a quiet hill, surrounded by dense trees that gave it an almost otherworldly quality. My aunt, who had lived there for most of her life, had moved to a care facility a few years prior. "You can stay as long as you need," she had told me, "but don't forget to keep the stairs swept." I thought it was a strange comment, but I didn't ask her to explain. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning and unpacking, and my evenings settling into the rhythm of living alone in such a large house. The quiet was both comforting and eerie, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a thunderclap. It started on the fourth night. I was lying in bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, a faint creak from the staircase. At first I dismissed it as the house settling. The place was old, after all, and the wood groaned constantly. But then it happened again. This time it was distinct. 2 deliberate creaks, like someone stepping slowly up the stairs. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, listening intently. The sound stopped, leaving the house in heavy silence. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand, I tiptoed out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The staircase loomed at the far end, the dim moonlight filtering through the stained glass window above it. I aimed the flashlight down the stairs. Nothing. The wooden steps stretched into the darkness below, empty and still. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the house playing tricks on me. But as I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again. A single, deliberate creak, this time from the top step. My heart raced as I shone the flashlight directly at the top of the stairs. There was no one there. I barely slept that night, every little sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination, a combination of exhaustion and nerves from being alone in such an old house. I even laughed at myself as I swept the stairs that afternoon, the rhythmic swish of the broom almost soothing. But the creaking continued, always at night, always slow and deliberate. Sometimes it came from the middle of the staircase, other times from the very top. I started to dread going to bed, my nerves fraying with each passing day. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to set up my phone to record the staircase. I placed it on a small table in the hallway, the camera pointed directly at the stairs, and hit record. Then I went to bed, leaving the phone to capture whatever was causing the noise. The next morning, I retrieved the phone, my stomach churning with equal parts fear and anticipation. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching the empty staircase bathed in moonlight. Hours passed with nothing unusual, just the faint sounds of the house settling. And then, at 3:12 a.m., the creaking started. My blood ran cold as I watched the screen. A shadow appeared at the bottom of the stairs, faint and shifting, like smoke curling in the air. It moved slowly upward, pausing on each step as the wood groaned under its invisible weight. By the time it reached the top of the stairs, the shadow had taken a vaguely humanoid shape, thin and angular, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It stopped at the top step, turning toward the camera. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Eyes? A face? The screen blurred as the shadow leaned closer, filling the frame with darkness. The recording ended abruptly. I packed my things that same day, leaving the house and its creaking stairs behind. My aunt called a few weeks later, asking why I'd left so suddenly. When I told her about the noises and the shadow, she sighed heavily. "I told you to keep the stairs swept," she said. "They don't like it when you forget." The face in the lake. When I was 13, my parents rented a lakeside cabin for the summer. It wasn't the kind of vacation I wanted. No Wi-Fi, no TV, and the nearest town was half an hour away. But my parents were determined to have a family bonding experience, so my protests were ignored. The cabin itself was quaint but old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that stuck when you tried to open them. Behind the house, a small dock extended into the lake, its weathered boards warped from years of sun and rain. The lake was massive, its dark water stretching out toward the horizon, surrounded by dense pine trees. There was only one other cabin on the far side, barely visible through the mist that lingered in the mornings. My dad assured me we'd have plenty to do: fishing, swimming, kayaking. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had as I stared out at the water. It was too still, too dark. The kind of lake that seemed to swallow everything whole. The first week was uneventful. My younger brother and I spent our days exploring the woods while my parents lounged on the porch, reading. At night, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of something breaking the water's surface. Then, on the 8th night, I saw it. I had woken up around midnight, thirsty from the day's hike. I tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake my family, and grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen. As I stood at the sink, sipping and staring out the window, something caught my eye, a faint ripple in the lake, just beyond the dock. At first, I thought it was a fish, or maybe a bird diving into the water. But then I saw it. A face, pale and ghostly, just beneath the surface. Its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. I froze, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering in the sink. When I looked again, the face was gone. The water was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had been there at all. I barely slept that night. The image of the face burned into my mind, its hollow eyes and slack features haunting me every time I closed my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the moonlight, a reflection distorted by the rippling water. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. My dad chuckled, ruffling my hair. "Probably a fish," he said dismissively. My mom was more sympathetic, but chalked it up to my imagination. "The lake can play tricks on you," she said, her voice soft but firm. That day, I avoided the dock, sticking close to the cabin while my brother and dad fished. I watched from the porch as they cast their lines, laughing and joking, completely unaware of the dark, foreboding feeling that gripped me every time I glanced at the water. That night, the face returned. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the dock. I sat up, my heart racing as I listened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. echoing through the quiet night. I crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the lake. The moonlight illuminated the water, its surface shimmering like black glass. And there, at the end of the dock, stood a figure. It was pale, almost translucent, its long hair dripping with water. Its head was tilted upward, as if it were looking directly at my window. I couldn't make out its features, but I didn't need to. I knew it was the same face I had seen in the water. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, pulling the curtain shut. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but fear kept me frozen. I stood there trembling as the tapping started again, this time on the window. I don't remember how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually the tapping stopped, and the night grew quiet once more. When I finally found the courage to peek out the window, the dock was empty. The next morning, I begged my parents to leave. My dad rolled his eyes, annoyed, but my mom seemed concerned. She agreed that we could cut the trip short, and by that afternoon, we were packed and on the road. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The water was still, shimmering in the midday sun. But just before we rounded the bend, I saw it again, floating just beneath the surface, watching us leave. The room that wasn't there. The apartment building wasn't anything special, just another aging brick structure in the heart of the city. I found the listing online, and the rent was surprisingly cheap for the area. The landlord, a wiry man in his late 50s, seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. "It's a great place," he said, smiling nervously. "Quiet. Perfect for someone like you." I didn't think much of his tone at the time. I was desperate for a place to stay, and the apartment had everything I needed. It was a modest one-bedroom, with large windows that overlooked the busy street below, and a kitchen that was just big enough to cook in. The walls were a little dingy, the floors creaked, and the paint peeled in some corners. But I didn't mind. It felt like home. The layout was straightforward. The kitchen, living room, bathroom, and bedroom were all connected by a short hallway. It wasn't until my second week there that I noticed something strange. It was late, and I had just come back from work. As I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. There was a door at the end of the hall that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I walked closer, running my fingers over the wooden frame. It was identical to the other doors in the apartment, complete with a brass knob that gleamed faintly under the dim hallway light. I tried the knob, but it was locked. Confused, I called the landlord the next morning. "Hey," I said hesitantly, "did you guys do some kind of renovation? There's a new door in my hallway." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "There shouldn't be a door there." "Well, there is now," I said. "It's locked, though." "Don't touch it," he said quickly, his tone sharp. "It's probably nothing. Just leave it alone." His answer didn't sit right with me, but I let it go for the time being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease every time I walked past the door. It was like it didn't belong there, a foreign object grafted onto my otherwise ordinary apartment. A few nights later, I was woken by a sound. It was faint at first, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way cautiously down the hallway. The tapping stopped as I approached, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I yanked my hand back, a shiver running down my spine. The door felt wrong, as if it were alive somehow, its presence pressing against me. The next day I bought a screwdriver and decided to force it open. I couldn't take the not knowing. If the landlord wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I'd find out for myself. When I removed the lock, the door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing. The room was empty. The walls were bare, the floor dusty. It was small, barely big enough to fit a bed, and it smelled faintly of damp wood and decay. In the far corner, there was a single chair, old and wooden, facing the wall. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air felt colder here, heavier. I crouched down to inspect the chair, noticing faint scratches etched into the wall in front of it. They formed words written haphazardly, as if someone had carved them in a frenzy. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the room seemed to grow darker. The door behind me slammed shut, and the temperature dropped sharply. I spun around, pounding on the door, screaming for someone, anyone, to help. Then, just as suddenly, the door swung open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The door closed behind me, and when I turned back, the lock was back in place, as if I'd never removed it. I left the apartment the next day, breaking the lease and losing my deposit. I couldn't stay there, not with that room, whatever it was, still lurking in the hallway. I've moved on since then, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that door. I wonder if someone else has opened it, if they've seen what I saw, or worse, if they've let something out. The smiling man. It was nearly 2 a.m., and I was walking home from a late shift at the diner. The streets were unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too intentional. Streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, their pale orange glow casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. The cool night air brushed against my skin, making me pull my jacket tighter around me. The route home wasn't long, just 15 minutes through mostly residential streets. But at night, it always felt a little eerie. I kept my head down, focusing on the sound of my boots clicking against the sidewalk, when I noticed him. He was standing across the street, under the flickering light of a lamppost. At first, I thought he was just another late-night wanderer, someone taking a shortcut or heading home like me. But something about the way he stood caught my attention. He was too still, his lanky frame rigid, his arms hanging unnaturally at his sides. He was tall, wearing a suit that seemed too big for him, the fabric hanging loosely off his thin shoulders. And then there was his face. Even from across the street, I could see his smile, a wide, toothy grin that stretched too far, like it was carved into his face. His head was tilted at an odd angle, as though he were studying me. I kept walking, forcing myself not to look at him again. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. His long legs carried him forward, slowly at first, matching my pace from the other side of the street. I quickened my steps, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him. The houses here were dark, their windows blank and lifeless, and the air felt heavier, colder. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. He was still there, but now He was on my side of the street. He wasn't running, wasn't even walking quickly. He moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm, each step long and fluid, as though he were gliding. His head remained tilted, that grotesque grin never wavering. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. I felt a surge of panic and broke into a run, my boots slamming against the pavement as I sprinted down the street. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from him. When I reached the corner, I risked a glance back. He was gone. I stopped, gasping for air, my hands on my knees as I tried to calm my racing heart. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe he was just some harmless weirdo and I'd overreacted. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned sharply, and there he was, standing in the middle of the street. His grin was wider now, his teeth gleaming in the faint light. He raised one long arm, pointing directly at me. "Stop!" I shouted, backing away. "Stay the hell away from me!" He didn't stop. He began to walk again, his movements smooth and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. My breath hitched as I turned and ran, weaving through side streets and alleys, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear his footsteps, always at the same steady pace, no matter how fast I ran. I burst onto a main road, my eyes darting around for help. There was no one, no cars, no pedestrians, just the hollow emptiness of the city at night. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the darkness. I ran toward it, practically throwing myself through the glass doors. The cashier looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. There's someone following me," I panted, clutching the counter for support. "He's outside." The cashier nodded slowly, stepping around the counter to peer through the glass doors. "I don't see anyone," he said, his tone skeptical. I turned, my heart sinking. The street outside was empty. The smiling man was gone. "Maybe you're just tired," the cashier said, offering a half smile. "Long night, huh?" I nodded weakly, too shaken to argue. I stayed in the gas station for nearly an hour, waiting until I felt brave enough to head home. When I finally stepped outside, the street was quiet. The walk back to my apartment was uneventful, though every shadow seemed to twist into his shape, and every sound made me flinch. I thought I was safe, but when I reached my building, I froze. He was there, standing under the streetlight across the road. His head was tilted farther now, almost upside down, and his grin seemed impossibly wide. He didn't follow me this time. He just stood there, watching as I hurried inside and locked the door. I haven't seen him since that night, but I know he's still out there. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched, and when I look out the window, I half expect to see him, standing under a flickering light, still smiling. The Whispering Trees. I grew up in a small town surrounded by dense forests. The woods were a constant presence in my childhood, a sprawling maze of tall pines and twisting trails that seemed to go on forever. My friends and I spent countless afternoons exploring, inventing games, and daring each other to venture deeper into the unknown. There was one part of the forest, though, that none of us ever went near: Hollow Grove. It wasn't marked on any map, but everyone in town knew about it. The trees there were older than the rest of the forest, their branches gnarled and twisted, casting eerie shadows even in broad daylight. Stories about the grove varied. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of people who had vanished there over the years. My grandmother used to warn me, never go near the hollow trees. They'll whisper your name. I thought it was just an old wives' tale. But everything changed when I turned 16. It was late summer, and my best friend Darren and I were hiking the trails behind my house. The sun was setting, and the forest was bathed in golden light. We had taken a path we didn't usually follow, one that veered deeper into the woods than we had planned. The air grew cooler, the trees denser, their trunks thicker and darker than those we were used to. "Where are we?" Darren asked, glancing around nervously. I hesitated, looking at the unfamiliar trees. The path had vanished beneath a blanket of moss and fallen leaves. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to sound calm. "But we should probably head back." That's when we heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. We froze, our eyes darting toward the sound. It was soft, almost indistinct, like the rustling of leaves. But as we stood there, listening, it grew clearer. A voice, low and hollow, calling our names. "Darren! Ella!" My blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, gripping Darren's arm. He nodded, his face pale. "We need to go." We turned and started walking quickly, our footsteps crunching against the undergrowth. But the whispering followed us, growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. "Ella," the voice hissed again, sending chills down my spine. It sounded closer now, as if it were right behind us. "Don't look back," Darren said, his voice trembling. "Just keep moving." I wanted to run, but something about the whispers rooted me to the spot. They weren't random noises. They were words, phrases that made no sense but felt deeply wrong. "Come closer. Stay with us. Don't leave." When we finally stumbled out of the grove and back onto a familiar trail, the whispers stopped. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. But as we turned to look back, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. A figure stood at the edge of the grove, half hidden among the trees. Its body was indistinct, blending with the shadows, but its eyes, two glowing orbs of pale light, stared directly at us. We ran all the way back to my house, not stopping until we were inside with the door locked. We never spoke about that day again, but I've avoided the forest ever since. Sometimes, though, on quiet nights I swear I can hear the trees whispering my name. The red balloon. The carnival came to town every summer, setting up in the large field on the outskirts of the city. It was the highlight of the year for most of us kids, with its flashing lights, colorful tents, and the smell of fried food wafting through the air. My friends and I would save up all year just to blow it all on rides and games that were overpriced and rigged. It was tradition. That summer, though, something felt different. The carnival seemed darker somehow. The lights were dimmer, the music quieter, and the crowd thinner than usual. Even the workers seemed off, silent, their faces blank as they operated the rides and handed out prizes. It was the last night of the carnival when I saw the balloon stand. I had never noticed it before, tucked away in the farthest corner of the field, partially hidden behind the funhouse. The stand was small, its wooden frame splintered and weathered, with no sign or lights to draw attention. A single red balloon floated above it, bobbing gently in the night breeze. The man behind the stand smiled as I approached. He was tall and thin, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken but sharp. "Would you like a balloon?" he asked, his voice soft and smooth. I hesitated. Something about him made my skin crawl. "How much?" I asked, my voice wavering. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No charge. It's yours to keep." I should have walked away. But there was something hypnotic about the balloon, its vibrant red contrasting starkly against the muted colors of the carnival. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the string as he handed it to me. The moment I touched it, a chill ran through my body. The man's smile widened, and he leaned in close, whispering, "Don't let go." I didn't understand what he meant until later. As I walked home, the balloon floated beside me, its string tight in my hand. But no matter how hard I tried to let it go, my fingers wouldn't release the string. It felt like it was part of me, the connection unbreakable. When I got home, I tied the balloon to the back of a chair and went to bed, hoping it would still be there in the morning. But when I woke up, it wasn't in the kitchen. It was in my room, hovering above my bed. The man's words echoed in my mind. "Don't let go." Over the next few days, the balloon followed me everywhere. It didn't matter where I went or how far I tried to run. It was always there, bobbing silently at my side. People began to notice, their eyes narrowing in confusion or fear as they passed me on the street. But no one said a word. On the 5th night, I woke to find it hovering inches from my face. The surface of the balloon had changed. It was no longer smooth and bright. It was dull, mottled with dark stains. And then I saw it, a face, faintly visible beneath the latex, its features contorted in a silent scream. I don't know how I managed to get rid of it. I only remember running into the woods, tying the string to a branch, and leaving it there as I sprinted back home. But sometimes, when I pass the edge of the forest, I swear I see it, floating just beyond the trees, waiting for me to come back. The shadow in the basement. When my parents bought the old Victorian house, they were thrilled. It was a steal, 6 bedrooms, a sprawling yard, and plenty of character. Sure, it needed some work, but my dad was handy, and my mom loved a good DIY project. From the moment we moved in, though, I hated the basement. It was cold and damp, with a low ceiling and a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows on the concrete walls. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and no matter how many times my mom cleaned, the scent never went away. I avoided it as much as possible, but my room was directly above it, and at night I could hear faint noises, scratching like something was moving down there. My dad insisted it was rats. "These old houses always have them," he said, setting traps in the corners. But the traps never caught anything, and the noises continued. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth beneath my room. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped directly below me. The next morning, I asked my parents if either of them had been in the basement. They both shook their heads. That evening, I worked up the courage to go down there. Armed with a flashlight, I descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step feeling like a leap of faith. The basement was empty, just the same boxes and old furniture covered in dust. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered, and I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, standing in the far corner. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The noises stopped after that night, but I never went into the basement again. Whatever was down there, It wanted to stay hidden, and I wasn't about to find out why. The stranger in the mirror. It started with small things. My reflection would linger for a split second longer than it should have, or it would blink when I hadn't. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Long hours at work, too much coffee, not enough sleep. It all made sense. But then it got worse. One morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth, and I noticed my reflection wasn't moving. It stared back at me, its eyes darker than mine, its expression too calm. I froze, my toothbrush clattering into the sink. The moment I looked away, it moved. I could see it in the corner of my eye, its head tilting slightly, its lips curling into a faint smile. I avoided mirrors after that. I covered the one in my bedroom and used my phone camera to check my appearance. But mirrors are everywhere. In store windows, car doors, even puddles. And no matter where I saw my reflection, it always seemed wrong. One night, I woke to the sound of shattering glass. The mirror in my bedroom had fallen to the floor, its surface fractured into a web of jagged cracks. I stared at it, my chest tightening, as I realized the reflection wasn't fractured, it was whole, and it was smiling. I don't use mirrors anymore, but sometimes, when I pass by one, I catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, something that's still waiting, still watching. The man in the barn. My grandparents' farm was my favorite place in the world when I was a kid. Summers there meant endless days of running through fields, climbing trees, and helping feed the animals. The old barn, though, always gave me the creeps. It stood at the far end of the property, its paint peeling and its doors sagging on rusted hinges. My grandmother warned me never to go inside. "It's not safe," she'd say. "It's old and falling apart." But one summer, when I was about 12, curiosity got the better of me. It was late in the afternoon, the golden light casting long shadows across the fields. My grandfather had gone into town, and my grandmother was napping. I decided to sneak out to the barn. The air smelled of hay and dust as I pushed open the creaking door, stepping into the cool darkness inside. The barn was mostly empty, its interior lit by rays of sunlight streaming through gaps in the wooden slats. Old tools and broken machinery were piled in the corners, and a rickety ladder led up to the loft. I climbed the ladder, my hands gripping the splintered wood as I hoisted myself up. The loft was filled with hay bales, some of them so old they had collapsed into piles of dust. And then I saw him. A man stood in the far corner, partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking as they locked onto mine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" I stammered. He didn't answer. He just stared, his head tilting slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed at me. I scrambled down the ladder, my hands trembling as I gripped the rungs. The barn felt colder now, the air thick and suffocating. When I reached the ground, I bolted for the house, not daring to look back. I told my grandmother what I had seen, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I had imagined it. Instead, her face went pale. "You went into the barn?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "There was a man up there." She shook her head, grabbing my shoulders and pulling me close. "There's no one in that barn," she said firmly. No one living anyway. I never went near the barn again. My grandparents sold the farm a few years later, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, I can still see his face, the pale skin, the wide eyes, the faint, unsettling smile. The flickering light. When I first moved into my apartment, I was thrilled. It was small but cozy, with a view of the city skyline and a rent I could actually afford. The building was old, though, with its fair share of quirks. The floors creaked, the plumbing groaned, and the hallway lights never stayed on for long. The light outside my door was the worst. It flickered constantly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. At night, I'd hear faint clicks as it blinked on and off, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway. One evening, as I was unlocking my door, the light flickered violently before going out completely. I sighed, fumbling with my keys in the sudden darkness. Then I felt it, a presence, like someone standing just behind me. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty. Shaking it off, I stepped inside and locked the door. I told myself it was just my imagination, the darkness playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. Every night after that, I felt it. The weight of someone watching me, their presence just beyond the edge of the flickering light. One night, I decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, I stepped into the hallway, the cold air prickling my skin. The light outside my door flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. Nothing. I shone the flashlight down the hall, sweeping it across the peeling wallpaper and faded carpet. When the beam reached the end of the corridor, I saw it, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its features obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. The flashlight flickered, and the figure was gone. I backed into my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. I didn't sleep that night, the faint clicks of the hallway light echoing in my ears. The next morning, I asked the landlord about the building's history. He frowned. "That hallway," he said, shaking his head. "It's been weird for years. Some tenant died there a long time ago. Nobody knows the details." I haven't seen the figure again, but I still feel its presence. Every time the light flickers, I wonder if it's still there, watching from the shadows. The hand in the window. Growing up, my bedroom faced the backyard, which sloped gently down toward a dense row of trees. At night, the yard was pitch black, the trees barely visible against the inky sky. My parents always kept the curtains closed, but one summer, I decided to leave them open. I liked the idea of falling asleep under the moonlight, with the stars shining down on me. The first night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. It was soft and rhythmic, coming from the window. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and peered into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just as my eyes adjusted, I noticed it. A pale hand pressed against the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the hand, its long fingers splayed out across the window. It was motionless, the skin unnaturally smooth and white, like porcelain. I scrambled out of bed, bolting down the hall to my parents' room. "There's someone outside my window!" I cried, shaking my dad awake. He grabbed a flashlight and followed me back to my room. But when we got there, the window was empty. The yard was silent, the grass undisturbed. He dismissed it as a bad dream, patting my shoulder and telling me to go back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. This time I woke to see not just a hand, but a face, pale and featureless, pressed against the glass. Its hollow eyes stared directly at me, unblinking. I screamed, and the face vanished, leaving nothing but the faint outline of breath on the window. My parents didn't believe me. "It's your imagination," my mom insisted. But I knew what I had seen. I started sleeping with the curtains closed after that. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the tapping again. I never opened the curtains to check. I didn't want to see what might be waiting for me on the other side. The elevator. The office building where I worked was modern and sleek, all glass and steel, with elevators that hummed smoothly as they ascended and descended. I'd taken the same elevator every day for years without a second thought. But one evening, as I was working late, I noticed something strange. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the building was empty except for me. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. Halfway down, it stopped. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. Then slowly, the elevator began moving. Up, not down. Panic bubbled in my chest as the elevator climbed past my floor, then the next, until it reached the 13th floor. The doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dark, the overhead lights flickering faintly. I stepped forward, peering into the shadows. The floor was supposed to be vacant, under renovation. But as I looked closer, I saw someone standing at the far end. The figure was motionless, its back to me. It wore a suit, its shoulders unnaturally broad, its head slightly tilted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just smooth, featureless skin. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled back into the elevator, slamming the close door button. The doors shut just as the figure reached them, and the elevator jolted downward. When it reached the ground floor, I ran out of the building, my chest heaving. I quit my job the next day. But even now, when I step into an elevator, I can't help but hold my breath, waiting for the lights to flicker and the doors to open on the wrong floor. The locked classroom. When I was in high school, there was an old classroom at the end of the east wing that had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. The door was scratched and scuffed, its paint peeling in jagged streaks. Rumors swirled about why it was off limits. Some said a student had died there years ago, while others claimed the teacher who used to work in that room had gone insane. No one ever saw the janitors go inside, and the principal refused to talk about it. Of course, that just made it irresistible. One rainy afternoon, as I was walking to my locker, I passed the door and noticed something unusual. It was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of darkness peeked through the opening, like a black hole against the sterile white walls of the hallway. My curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching and pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the faint gray light streaming through the rain-streaked windows. Desks were scattered haphazardly, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. The blackboard at the front of the room was cracked, faint chalk markings barely visible beneath the grime. The air was heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching softly against the debris on the floor. For a moment, it was eerily silent, the only sound the steady patter of rain against the windows. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the sound, straining to see what might be lurking there. "Help me." The whisper came again, soft and pleading. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped, replaced by a faint shuffling noise like something or someone moving across the floor. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer, squinting into the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tightly over its skull. Hollow black eyes stared up at me, unblinking. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure moved, its limbs unfolding in slow, jerky motions as it rose to its full height. It was tall, far taller than any person should be, and it began to move toward me, its footsteps silent despite the debris on the floor. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hand shook as I locked it with the old, rusted key still hanging from the knob. When I turned around, the hallway was empty. The rain outside had stopped, and the silence was deafening. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if my mind had conjured the figure from years of rumors and ghost stories. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the other side of the door. I never told anyone what I saw that day, and I avoided the East Wing for the rest of my time at school. Last year, the building was demolished to make way for a new sports complex. Sometimes I wonder if they found anything when they tore it down, but part of me hopes they didn't. Some doors are better left closed.